I should probably say that I come to landscape architecture and landscape planning from geology. So that's why I'm particularly interested in some of the underground dynamics related to sea level rise. And that's where the group I've been working with, we've developed a proposal for changing urban districts to prepare for underground water as well as the lateral flooding from sea level rise. So shall I start? Okay. Welcome to San Francisco Bay. I know travel is a little confusing and difficult right now, so I thought I'd start with an image that shows you one of the grand locations of the Bay Area. It's a view towards San Francisco from Marin Headlands across the Golden Gate. One of the characteristics of our region, and I wanted to give you a sense of context because the series of challenges that we face is really shaping the adaptation strategies that we're talking about. And one of the major challenges we face is the risk of an earthquake. In our region, and there's the San Francisco Bay in blue and the coast of California underneath those blue fault lines. Our region is on the edge of the North American plate, and we're expecting a 7.5 or an 8 earthquake any day about a kilometer from my house. So if it happens today and the electricity goes off, that'll be your clue to what's going on. But we are in a very active earthquake zone, and that shapes our options for how to adapt. This is a map that shows the liquefaction risks in the high risk zones are in red. They've left out the city of San Francisco. The news must be just so bad, nobody even wants to show it. This is the city of Oakland over here. This is where I'm sitting over here. So much of the region has between a very high and moderate risk of liquefaction. And so the next question would be, well, what's liquefaction? Liquefaction is a process that can make a solid soil behave like a liquid when an energy wave comes through it for an earthquake. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here in this little demonstration. The hammer hitting the bucket full of water and sand simulates the energy wave of an earthquake. And the sand behaves more like a liquid because it's wet once the energy wave comes through. And that's what we're concerned about rising sea levels and rising groundwater, that we may find ourselves in a situation where the soil behaves like a liquid. And as sea level and groundwater continue to rise, more and more areas could be affected by this dynamic. Sorry, I'm trying to move forward here. And this is the kind of thing that actually happens in the real world. This particular example is from Christchurch, New Zealand, after their earthquake almost 10 years ago now, where a vehicle actually did just fall into the sand when the earthquake occurred there. And a lot of that sand had a high water table. So I'm creating a little theme here. I'm foreshadowing one of the themes that we talk about in sea level rise adaptation in this region. So now sea level rise. Of course, we're on the ocean, and we're aware that that sea levels have been rising at fast and slow rates over time. This is about 20,000 years ago. And there was a fast period here at the kind of famous in geology meltwater pulse 1A, and then mostly a continued fast rate of sea level rise until about 10,000, 8,000 years ago. And of course, this is the era when cities first appear as a phenomenon in human culture. So we've never actually operated cities during a period of rapid sea level rise, even though rapid sea level rise has occurred before. So we're trying to figure this out, and no one really exists who can give us a lot of advice about it. And if it seems a little difficult, it is difficult, and it's something that humans haven't had to do before with cities. This is the guidance that the state of California has given public agencies about how to think about sea level rise, and it's different from the guidance that's given in most European countries that I'm aware of. This shows 1 meter of sea level rise in 3 scenarios where we'd expect to be at 1 meter in the best case by 2096, in the more likely medium case by 2068, and in an extreme case by around 2050. So the state of California is telling municipalities, public agencies at all levels to think about how long the investment is that they're making. If they're building something they expect to be permanent, that they should be using this extremely high scenario, because we know we're going to get at some point to 3 meters of sea level rise. We believe we're pretty much committed to that based on how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And the question is, when will we get there? So they say permanent investments should be making this assumption for the scenario for sea level rise, 1 meter by 2050 about. Smaller investments could be using the medium high scenario of 1 meter by 2068, and then low cost, temporary or very short-term investments like a path or a new public toilet in a park. Those kinds of things could use a low scenario of 1 meter by 2096. So I think that helps give context, since not every country is using the same estimates for sea level rise. And in the United States, each state actually gives the guidance for what public agencies should anticipate. From an ecological perspective, the San Francisco Bay is a massive experiment. This is our native marsh grass, Spartina foliosa, and this is what much of the Bay Edge looks like. You can see a highway up here. A lot of the land has been restored to salt marshes, and a lot more of it is planned for restoration. But what's going on ecologically during that restoration is that there are 2 different salt marsh grasses. The one I just showed you, which is a native, which means it was here in the region before European and Asian settlers arrived. And this one, which is not native or characteristic of the region, it was brought in the 1970s from the US East Coast. It's a different marsh grass, and it tends to be a little taller. But what's interesting about it is that these 2 marsh grasses have hybridized. So they've combined and they reproduce, they fertilize each other, and then it produces a daughter hybrid plant, which is more vigorous than either parent, which is not unusual for a hybrid plant. But what it does is it creates a taller, stiffer, stronger marsh grass. And this marsh grass has been 95% eradicated, removed physically and with herbicide treatments around the entire 1,000 miles of the Bay Edge. And it's been removed because of a kind of ecological purism about what species are characteristic of the region. Unfortunately, this daughter plant, it's almost like a Greek myth, you know, this invader and the native have a daughter, and the daughter turns out to be extra powerful. And the daughter plant is actually exactly what we need for a rising sea level, because it accumulates more sediment and helps to raise the surface of the wetland, the marsh. So it would be really helpful if we would recognize the value of it and stop eradicating it, and recognize that our endangered bird, this is called the Ridgway's rail, it's an endemic bird in California that isn't found in other places. It makes its nest in this hybrid daughter plant, which is stiffer and stronger, and accumulates more sediment. So we're trying to learn from the way animals are adapting to think about how we need to adapt and give up some of our categories that we've thought of as very precious about what's characteristic or native and what's invasive and what should be eradicated and what should be kept. In the restoration of marshland around the Bay Edge, you can see here in gray all the areas that used to be tidal marsh. So we were in an estuary. Here's the Pacific Ocean on this side. And all of this was marshland all the way back here into the Delta. This is all the San Francisco Bay, all the salt marsh or saltwater habitat. And it was about 80,000 hectares. And now it's somewhere close to 18,000 hectares. And the goal is to restore 40,000, to get up to 40,000 hectares of restored, recreated tidal marsh. So there's an ambitious experiment happening here, which I think is the largest in the world, at what would happen if we were able to restore all these marshes. And unfortunately, sea level rise is happening just at the time when we thought we had this marsh strategy in place, and we were going to use the marshes to maintain biodiversity, provide aesthetic values, protect people's coastal homes from wave energy. And now that's what we're talking about with sea level rise, is maintaining this marsh edge and having to raise its elevation over time artificially, because there isn't enough sediment in the water in the coastline to be able to raise the elevation naturally as sea level rises. So we're talking about various artificial strategies for how to make you probably have heard of the Dutch sand engine or sand motor. This is our marsh motor. We're talking about making it happen artificially, that we'll be able to try to keep it up with sea level over time. This is just one example of a particularly beautiful photo where the salt marshes around the San Francisco Bay were converted to salt ponds. And some of those salt ponds used to harvest salt are being converted back to salt marshes with salt marsh grasses. They're red and pink and such amazing colors because of the brine organisms that live in these hypersaline, super salty environments of salt ponds. But what I bring it up also because we've been thinking about ponds here in the area for a long time. And I use that term for small bodies of water created by artificial dikes, which is how these salt ponds have been created and managed over time, and how the marshes that we're rebuilding in them are also managed over time. Now I want to talk about groundwater rise, which is a big concern here because of its association with liquefaction, as well as with other kinds of flooding. I'm sure you're talking about this to some extent also in Denmark. So as sea level rises, and this cartoon shows in darker blue salty water, salt water extends below the land and creates pressure pushing upwards on fresh groundwater, and this thin, dry crust of land that we build and live on in urban areas is going to be affected by this dynamic. So I'll show you in this cartoon what we expect the stages to be. So as the salt groundwater rises, it'll infiltrate our existing pipes. And in the United States, most pipes are cracked at the joints because they haven't been maintained over the last 70 years. So unlike Europe and more like many other countries around the world, in Latin America or other places, our pipes are cracked, and we expect them to fill with groundwater as it rises. We'll begin to also see events where our creeks, which are often dry during 6 months of the year, have more water in them. And we'll see legacy pollution that's been capped from above but not lined from below in the soil, say from an old gas station or an old dry cleaners, also old factories and military bases. That pollution, which was sealed from above but not from below, will be remobilized and head towards the bay, as well as potentially towards people's houses. So all of this will happen. The lost capacity in storm sewer pipes and sanitary sewer pipes that carry human waste, the remobilization of cancer-causing soil pollution, the flooding in the creeks, and eventually emergence of that water as flooding at the surface. And this is all happening in spite of the fact that there's a dike along the water's edge, because without extensive pumping networks, there'll be no way to prevent groundwater from rising behind a seawall or a dike. And that's why there are extensive pumping networks in many coastal areas. There's no way that this structure can prevent this deep and lateral dynamic from occurring. Since this water comes from rainwater, it's coming from all the areas uphill, and that can't be blocked. So we have to all figure out how we want to deal with rising groundwater behind dikes and levees. And we tell ourselves, this is an illustration from a children's book, that peels away the concrete on the street and shows us what's underneath the street, at least in an American city that dates back to the late 19th century. This kind of infrastructure is what's under our streets. And we tell ourselves that this dry crust of land is going to stay dry, but in fact, it's not. And as it gets wet, it's going to be very, very expensive to maintain. And systems, electrical systems, sewer systems, are going to begin to fail. Here's what's already beginning to happen. I'll just show you this quickly. It's just somebody's cell phone video of high tide. You can see it's a sunny day, and the high tide underneath this manhole has filled the pipe and is actually coming up and causing a small amount of spot flooding locally in the city of Alameda. But this is not an exceptional high tide, and it indicates that the groundwater is already pressing up out of the ground. This is an example of a flood that happened historically in Paris in January 1910, where the Seine didn't actually overflow its banks, but emerged through the soil because of a lot of rain having saturated the soil. The groundwater around the river actually came up through the ground and emerged at the surface. So this particular flood actually was driven by groundwater rise rather than, overflowing of banks. And here's an example, another one. I've spent some time in Christchurch talking to people about sea level rise and picked up some examples there. This one shows a woman trying to clean out a drain on the street edge, but the water is actually coming up through the drains on a day when the sea level rose because of low pressure weather and a high tide. So she's trying to clear out the drain to allow this water to drain away, and she doesn't realize that it's come up through the drain. And that's what's going to happen with our stormwater infrastructure. We're going to see water actually come up through the structures that we've designed to take water away. And here's what's happening just down the block from her in that location in Christchurch. This is water running down the block also, and it's coming over the end of a street, a little park, and it's the ocean. It's the ocean actually coming in over the edge of a street on a high tide day. So I feel like that's useful as an example of thinking about how imminent all of this is. Christchurch is having this situation occur somewhat earlier, in part because of their earthquake, which tilted the land by a meter. That whole landscape is now topographically different, and urban areas that were built in one spot are now lower than they were historically. So now I want to talk about adaptation, because when we kind of make the list of all the challenges we have, it can sound like it's daunting, like it's going to be difficult to adapt, but actually we have some ideas about how we could adapt, and we needed to understand what the different challenges were so that we could imagine how to thread the needle and find adaptation solutions that work for these different challenges that we face. A famous landscape architect in the United States said that the essence of landscape architecture is to dig hole and make mound. And I like that because it makes it so clear how important it is to understand local cut and fill and how much landform changes can allow us to adapt to new conditions. And I've added to his quote, dig hole, make mound, and moat, because that's how we're going to allow groundwater and other seawater to exist in the urban environment, but not overwhelm it. We're learning from some Dutch examples that we think are in some ways particularly relevant. This one is at a suburban area outside of Rotterdam. It's called Nesselande, and it's an artificial pond that was excavated, and then high-end housing was built in the pond to take some pressure off of housing markets around the pond. And the pond is also used to store stormwater. And in that pond, houses have been built on columns or piling foundations. They're not floating, but everyone has access to water views and feels like they're very much on the water. So it's aesthetically an interesting experience. It's also infrastructure. It's providing a public benefit. And what they're doing is selling properties to wealthy people to live in public infrastructure. And that to me seems like an incredible, important economic innovation that we could use in our land markets in the United States, where we want people to help us figure out how to pay for public investments in infrastructure, and selling housing to people with a lot of social and economic capacity in the infrastructure could help defray the public costs, help reduce the public costs. It also puts the most secure and entitled people in a situation that might be a little more innovative. I don't want to say risky, but if they see a little crumbling in the dike, they are absolutely going to call someone. Where if we put innovative infrastructure in an area where people are poor and it's a single mother with 3 or 4 children and works 2 jobs, she's not going to feel entitled to call and complain. And so it's kind of the ultimate monitoring device to put wealthy people in an innovative infrastructure context, because they will absolutely call and complain if something seems to go wrong. So that may be an important insight for us. And then we look at this floating district in Steiger Island in Amsterdam, and we're particularly interested in floating because one of the innovations in California to deal with our earthquakes is to build what's called water displacement foundations that are essentially bearing the weight of the building on the groundwater that's in the soil. And that's already happening. In fact, I think there's a section of it that's been built at the new Apple Corporation headquarters here in California. So these are floating structures, most of them, the ones here in the center. This is conventional foundation and this is a conventional foundation, but the pier is fixed. And then the floating structures that are built in a modular way and towed into place by tugboats are just affixed to these piers. I think this one has a conventional foundation, but the rest are floating. And we think that's interesting because it may be the best fit with our earthquake risks and liquefaction risks. So what we're thinking of in a kind of cartoon version is to excavate ponds and then place that material at the wetland edge to add to the elevation of our wetlands that I started this presentation with. Dig hole, make mound, but actually allow there to be canals and moats here too, and then float modular buildings in these areas, which otherwise, unless we do something like this, many districts of our urban areas along the bay are going to lose value completely. So the no action alternative, if we do nothing, all of these lands will lose value. And even building a levee here won't prevent that from happening. And if we pump, which is another alternative, we expect the land to subside because a lot of these districts are built on old wetland soils. And we've learned in New Orleans that if you pump old wetland soils, they collapse. And parts of New Orleans have collapsed 2 meters. Much of the edge of the San Francisco Bay could also collapse if we pump. And so we have to come up with other ways of adapting to this high water. And we're looking at the Dutch examples because they represent a way of living with that high water. And I'm just going to show you a quick video here of how we talk to the public about some of this. This is an example of a student using claymation in one of my classes. And now I talk to the public using this claymation to try to show people there's groundwater, there's an existing saltwater creek. The first step would be to excavate the ponds and use the cut material to make dikes around those ponds. And then to allow the groundwater to be exposed. It's going to come up anyway once we excavate. And we might excavate these 2, 3, maybe 4 meters to be able to do floating foundations of shared decking, not individual units floating, but a shared deck shown here, and then modular units placed on that shared decking for new residential districts. And that just shows a pedestrian pathway around the residential district. And we think that these kinds of strategies may work for many parts of the Bay Area edge. And this is the drawing that we've used in a professional competition to try to explain. We're talking about not just one pond, but a mosaic of tidal ponds that might be like a kind of honeycomb spread out, lots of ponds, a network of them, an armature of dikes that surround these excavated ponds, using the cut material to add to our wetlands or raise these levees around the edge, but maintaining tide gates at the edges of the ponds to let salt water come in and out with the tides and allow fresh water from higher up in the creeks to flush the water quality in these ponds. We're talking about using parks on the uphill side to filter urban stormwater as it comes into the ponds, because nutrients, of course, can cause algal blooms in the ponds and cause algal blooms in the bay. So we're talking about using the ponds partly to clean water on its way from the hills to the bay, and also to allow us to make use of this land as it gets wetter and wetter. As that groundwater rises, we expect the soil to start to behave more soupy. So we have, most of our geology here is loose gravels, alluvium, and we know that that's going to fill with water pretty quickly as this dynamic continues. And this is another illustration of a similar situation where there's already a long dike and a wetland on the outside of the dike and pump stations on the inside. And here we're talking about adding density as we add this floating district. The student was showing even a floating soccer field here, which I don't know if we could actually justify the cost of that, but it would be fun. And then we'd be providing habitat for our unusual bird that lives in the marsh, and also a number of other species like the salt marsh harvest mouse that are considered federally endangered. So we're trying to figure out how to maintain this biodiverse edge, how to provide continued housing in an area that's going to turn into a soup without causing subsidence, and in a way that prepares us for earthquake events. This is another example. This is one that we entered into a competition in 2018. This shows the excavated pond again, the high water table, the floating modular units on shared decking. And here are some buildings that actually probably would have to be more like 15 or 20 stories high to justify the cost of very expensive pile foundations that would prepare them for an earthquake. And when we show these images in the context of the places that are at risk the most around the Bay Area, right now, the places that face the most risk are filled with lower income people who, because of systemic racism, they were forced to live in these areas that used to be industrial. They weren't allowed to move to other neighborhoods, which were maintained as white neighborhoods. And that segregation, that housing restriction, left a lot of people who are still low income and have less access to education and suffer more from air pollution of the highways that come along the Bay Edge, left them vulnerable to this rising groundwater phenomenon and the health risks that are associated with remobilized soil contamination. So this is a dynamic that's happening possibly today, underground, unknown, and unmonitored in our lowest income neighborhoods where African-American families live and Latino families. And we're trying to figure out how to create these new housing areas that are inclusive and that work for low income people. And fortunately, the Steiger Island development in Amsterdam is a good example of subsidized housing that was built for lower income residents. But a lot of our lower income residents are nervous about being part of a new experiment like this. They don't want to have their families at risk of stepping off a walkway into the water. They're not comfortable living on the water. So one possibility is that we would add a feature to this design. I'm going to show a very simple idea, but again, a physical model that we use to talk to public audiences. This is a section model that shows ice melting on the two ends, and we're going to see the groundwater rising in the middle. This is a line that represents the water coming up inside the model. And on one side, there's a conventional street. On the other side, there's a canal and a street. And there's a little hole in the plexiglass here. And as you see the water rise, you'll start to see it trickle out here. That's what's happening there. And the groundwater stops rising in spite of the fact that the water is rising still on this side with the same amount of water being introduced into the model. So we're trying to explain to people how canals work, that if you have a canal, you can keep the groundwater table a little lower under existing housing. And that's a real key to coming up with a way to adapt that recognizes the economic differences that we've created through systemic racism in the United States. So what we're thinking about doing here is coming up with a floating district that would be potentially at market rate, and then using canals to protect existing housing in low-income neighborhoods on the back side of those floating areas. And this is a rail corridor. We're also talking about putting highways in tunnels or elevating them, but that creates new problems. So it's a complex knot of different infrastructure, but the basic strategy is to adapt in place and maintain the value of land in our region by doing a mix of canals and this floating housing. And I'll show you what our thinking is at this point about how this is going to change over time. So here's an example of floating housing on shared decking at a typical low tide today, a typical mean tide, and an unusual high tide, today's unusual high tide. And you can see the edges begin to fray a little bit, depending on, of course, how high the dikes and levees are. As we get more sea level rise, so as we get to about 1 meter of sea level rise, we think this would all work in the same way, even though it's beginning to be inundated in the surroundings. But as we get to 1.5 meters to 2 meters of sea level rise, we think that these dikes and levees would need to be a lot larger. And that's the point where we'd have to ask ourselves, is it worth continuing to maintain these ponds, or should we relocate them at about 2 meters of sea level rise? And what we're talking about for that relocation is that there might be an initial band of ponds and canals or creeks headed to those ponds with wetlands on the bay edge. Now we're looking, this is the land side and this is the San Francisco Bay side. In our first phase, we would start with one band of ponds along the edge and then excavate a second band of ponds and turn this first band of ponds back into wetlands. Because by then, our original wetlands, we won't be able to raise the surface any higher, and we'll have to abandon that first band of wetlands and start moving in, like planning to roll up the carpet as we go. So in the end, it is a retreat strategy, a managed retreat strategy, but for the economic values that we could maintain for the next 50 to 100 years, it's an adaptation in place strategy. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to close with this slide and open up for questions. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and I'm excited to hear what your thoughts are.